Hey Bio20s, I'm back again for another lesson. Today we are going to be learning about the light-dependent reaction, so the first half of photosynthesis. Okay, so when we talk about photosynthesis, there are two main molecules that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about glucose and we're going to talk about ATP. Now glucose, this is the one you've probably heard about before. This is the molecule where we know that we go through photosynthesis, we do all the different steps, we do all the different reactions, and glucose is our final product, right? Glucose is a high energy molecule, and it's a form of chemical energy. So it's a form of chemical energy that the plant can use later. ATP, on the other hand, is a energy molecule that we use to make the glucose. So another way to think about it is ATP is kind of like the intermediate or the in-between step going from solar to glucose. So we essentially go solar energy, ATP, glucose. And there's a few more steps and reactants along the way, of course. So how I like to think of ATP is I like to think of ATP as a charged battery, right? So you take your cell phone's fully charged, that's a molecule of ATP. If you want to use your cell phone, you want to use your ATP, you're going to use the energy for various things, right? Like going on TikTok or who knows what, right? Now, when you're done with the ATP and it's then been used, we now have a low battery, and we call that ADP. So the T and the D, so ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, so it essentially has 3 phosphates on it. Adenosine diphosphate only has 2. So what happens is this molecule kicks off a phosphate, and now you're left with ADP and a phosphate. If you want to go back to ATP, you essentially have to find a way to take the ADP, stick another phosphate on it, to then make the ATP again, which is like charging your cell phone. Okay, and then another molecule that is very, very important in this process is something called NADPH. So this is called nicotinamide dinucleotide phosphate, or NADP+. NADP+ is fine. You're going to take that molecule, add a hydrogen onto it, and then 2 electrons. And that's going to make a molecule called NADPH. Now NADPH is, another way I like to think about it is it's a electron carrier. It's like an electron boat, or train or plane or whatever you want to think of it. It's going to take electrons from point A to point B. So it's going to take electrons from one part of the chloroplast and then bring them to another part of the chloroplast. So NADPH, when you see that abbreviation, you're going to think electron carrier. It's going to take these high energy electrons and transport them to where they need to go. Okay, so in the process of photosynthesis, there are essentially 2 main parts: light dependent, light independent, and 3 main steps. So the first 2 steps are part of the light dependent reaction. We have capturing solar energy, and then we have electron transfer and ATP synthesis. And then the third part, which is part of the independent reaction, this is Calvin cycle and Karbon's fixation. So if we were to break this down here, the light dependent reaction, so the light dependent, meaning it needs light to function, would take place within the thylakoid. Those are those green discs within the chloroplast. That's where the light dependent reaction will take place. The light independent reaction, which is happening over here, takes place in the stroma. So for the light dependent reaction to function, we need light, we need water, H2O, we need NADP+, and I will add in here, we're also going to need some hydrogen, and we're going to need some electrons as well. We are also going to need some ADP and phosphate, so your low battery molecule, and all of those molecules are going to go into the thylakoid and go through the light dependent reaction. Once again, they're going to go through solar energy capture, electron transport or transfer, and ATP synthesis. That's all going to happen during the light dependent reaction. Coming out of the light dependent reaction, we're going to have oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. Now oxygen is actually just a byproduct. Oxygen is just given off by the plant, which we as humans are very helpful for that. It's probably the most important byproduct in all of time. Plant doesn't need the oxygen. We, of course, need the oxygen. But yeah, oxygen is just a basically a waste product. The thing that the plant cares about is the ATP and the NADPH. So essentially the plant is trying to take light energy and water and then create ATP and NADPH. Okay, so when you look inside of a chloroplast, you're going to see these clusters of photosynthetic pigments. We refer to them as photosystems. This is essentially a bundle of things like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, all those different pigment photon trapping molecules. They're jammed together in what's called a photosystem. And we have two photosystems. We have PS2, photosystem 2, or PS1, photosystem 1. And their job is to capture solar energy. So when the sun hits a plant, the photons in that energy will hit the photosystem inside of the chloroplast, specifically inside of the thylakoid. Remember, the photosystems are literally embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Then these photons are going to hit an electron and energize it or excite it. And another way to think of this is it's kind of like if you've ever seen a kid at a birthday party who's maybe had a little bit too much sugar, that would be an energized electron. Like, it is very excited. It is a high energy molecule. It is vibrating like crazy. So we essentially want to charge up these electrons and use them to make some ATP. That's the ultimate goal here. Now, where do these electrons come from? Are they just kind of floating around? No, they actually come from water. This is why water is needed for the light-dependent reaction. When water splits, it will actually split into hydrogen, oxygen, that's where the oxygen comes from, and an electron. And this process is called photolysis. What happens here is you take a water molecule, so H2O, you essentially split it, giving off hydrogen, oxygen, and an electron. When the electron comes in contact with a photon, or the solar energy, it gets excited and charged up. And then it's going to go through this transport system called the electron transport chain, which I'll show you in a little bit. And the electron transport chain is essentially going to take some of that energy and use it for later. And then once the electron is gone, we then need to replenish the missing electron. So we're going to take another water molecule, split it, more electrons, and then hydrogen and oxygen move over here. Now the oxygen is going to find another oxygen molecule, bind together, make O2, and there you go. That's where oxygen's created from. Now, this is what we call a oxidation reaction, right? So an oxidation reaction is where something loses an electron. So if we go back here, we'll go back to the actual equation. It's water. Water's over here. That's on the reactants. The electron's on the products. This is what we call an oxidation reaction. If you ever see the electron on the product side of the equation, you know it's oxidation because you are losing that electron. You're producing it. It is going away, okay? The opposite of that would be a reduction reaction where you are gaining electrons. So in this example, here's my oxidation reaction. I take my NADPH, which we talked about earlier. If I were to then turn it into NADP+, H+, and 2 electrons, I would be giving up 2 electrons. We would count that as a oxidation reaction. Now, if I were to take, say, NADP+, add 2 electrons and hydrogen to make NADPH, this is a reduction reaction because we are gaining electrons. The electrons are on the reactant side of the process. And when we put these two reactions together, we call it a redox reaction, where one thing is oxidizing and one thing is reducing. So we then always combo these together where something is being reduced, something is being oxidized, and overall we call this a redox reaction. Now it might seem a little confusing at first. These are really good ways to remember it. You can think Leo the lion says grr. So Leo, loss of electrons is oxidation. So if you lose electrons, you're oxidizing. Gain electrons is reduction, grr. If you gain an electron, you're reducing. Or another way to remember it, we're here in Alberta, oil rig. Oxidation is loss, losing electrons, oxidation, reduction is gain. Gaining electrons, reduction. So that's another way to remember those two. Now, if we look at it in terms of the entire process of photosynthesis, once again, we have two molecules, CO2 and water. We haven't talked about the CO2 yet, but we will next video. But in this entire equation, water, like we did talk about, is losing an electron, becoming oxygen. Since it's losing an electron, water is being oxidized, giving off 2 electrons. CO2, on the other hand, is going to be reduced, which means CO2 is going to gain some electrons in this process to become C6H12O6, which is the formula for glucose. Okay, so in this process, once again, gaining, losing electrons, in this process, the entire process is essentially built around this idea, gaining, losing electrons. So when we look at a zoomed in picture of the chloroplast, specifically the thylakoid, this is a thylakoid here. This is the outer membrane. So this is outside the thylakoid. This is inside the thylakoid. We see here, there is my water molecule. So there's my water molecule, and it's being oxidized to make oxygen, hydrogen, and of course, some electrons. It's losing those electrons. Now, once again, the oxygen is going to find another oxygen. It's going to join up to make O2, and that's literally just going to be released by the plant. The hydrogen, excuse me, the hydrogen, we'll just save that for now. We'll focus on the electron. So the electron is going to be energized by the photosystem. So the electron is going to be energized by that photosystem. And the weird thing here, and I know it's kind of odd, but the first photosystem that the electron is going to come in contact with is actually photosystem 2. Then photosystem 1, it just came down to which one was discovered first and which one was discovered second. So electron is going to enter photosystem 1, be charged up with light, and then go down what's called the electron transport chain, or the ETC. As it goes down the ETC, which is essentially a channel of proteins within the membrane, it will be transported to photosystem number 1. Now, as it's moving down that electron transport chain, it's going to be losing energy. So when it gets to photosystem 1, it is going to recharge. So it's going to go back, photosystem 1, recharge, grab another electron, grab a hydrogen, and then join with NADP+ to form NADPH. That is our electron carrier. So the whole job of the electron transport chain is to get the electrons from water, energize them, and send them all the way to make NADP+, NADPH, which we will need later for the Calvin cycle. Now remember, electrons are negatively charged. While the electrons are moving down the electron transport chain, these hydrogen ions are being attracted to them, right? Because they're positively charged. And not only that, hydrogen ions that are floating outside of the membrane are now going to move into the membrane to get closer to the electrons. And it builds what we call a charged gradient. It's kind of like a dam, where the dam is holding back the water. The electrons passing along the membrane will actually produce this charge gradient where all the positives inside, but it can't get out. So now the inside of the thylakoid is way more positive than the outside, and these electrons keep pulling in more and more and more and more hydrogen. So once again, it's like building up a charge, building up a dam. And then what we're going to do is we are actually going to use those hydrogen molecules to make ATP. Because the hydrogen now wants to get out. As you might have heard before, nature, it hates gradients. It wants to get rid of them. It doesn't like gradients. So what it wants to do is even out this balance. So it wants to take all the hydrogen that's inside and pump it outside. So the only way for hydrogen to leave the membrane is through this very fancy complex called an ATP synthase complex. And it's like a little tiny motor, it's like a molecular motor. The hydrogen will move through the complex, be pumped out of the membrane, but every time it moves and spins, it takes an ADP, slaps a phosphate onto it, and makes ATP. And this process we call chemiosmosis. So we see all this hydrogen building up inside the membrane. It wants to leave. The only way out is through the ATP synthase complex. And then when we do that, we make some ATP. So essentially we take an ADP, put a phosphate on it, and create ATP. So this entire process, we've taken water, we've taken light, right? And we've also taken NADP plus, NADP, and we've created oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. Now the oxygen, that's given off for byproduct. The ATP, the NADPH, we're going to use in the next part of the cycle, which is called the light-independent reaction. And that's what we're going to talk about next video. So, thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.